Support for this program is provided by the men and women of the Louisiana Forestry Association. Through sustainable forestry, LFA members promote the health and productivity of Louisiana's forests for generations to come. And the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.
Good evening and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm Beth Courtney.
And I'm Craig Freeman. Imagine if you were given 5 months to come up with suggestions on making state government run more efficiently. That was the assignment for the Streamlining Government Commission created legislatively last year. 46 public hearings later, including stops in Monroe, Alexandria, Shreveport, Lake Charles, and Harahan, the Commission released its final report on January the 4th. Tonight, we examine the panel's proposals and their possible effects on Streamlining Louisiana 2010.
Well, the increased emphasis on downsizing, cost shifting, outsourcing, and waste reduction is driven by stark economic projections. Louisiana faces more than $1 billion revenue shortfall this year and a $2 billion deficit in 2011. Governor Jindal has ruled out any tax increase to balance the budget and insists that the difference be made up through spending cuts. So, which of the Commission's recommendations hold the most promise for savings, and where were cost-cutting opportunities missed? Confronted with the worst budget crisis in more than 2 decades, what role will the Streamlining Commission play in guiding Louisiana through the next 2 years? Covering the length of an entire conference room table, these cost control reports document a 40-year history of Louisiana's economic lows.
Whenever the state gets in a real financial pinch, you usually see one of these commissions pop up.
Jim Brandt is president of the Public Affairs Research Council, or PAR. The latest addition to PAR's collection of efficiency reports is the one from the Louisiana Streamlining Commission.
This is volume 1 of the most recent report released in early January. 2-volume set, 238 recommendations on how to streamline state government.
Established during last year's regular legislative session, the Commission on Streamlining Government was tasked with helping the state prepare for the projected $3 billion budget shortfall it faces over the next 2 years. Brandt feels while providing a good starting point, the report itself falls short.
In this case, I think the recommendations sort of were all over the water in terms of some cost-saving recommendations, some actually would increase the cost to state government, and some really didn't have anything to do with cost at all.
Capitol Bureau Chief for the Times-Picayune, Robert Travis Scott, agrees.
If the expectation of the Streamlining Commission was to fundamentally restructure the way government operations work and create a really powerful mandate for changing state government operations, then I think you'd have to say that it did not fulfill that goal.
Well, I think the Commission did a good job in the 4 months that we had, 5 months that we had to do that.
Senator Jack Donahue is chairman of the Streamlining Commission. He says that while the 10-member body was originally charged with reducing the cost and size of government in general terms, they were soon given a specific target.
Probably 6 weeks after we started meeting, the governor wrote a letter and asked us to try to help fund $802 million. So, we started trying to see what we could do to try to fulfill those goals, too. Whether we get $802 million of recommendations that the governor and the legislature want to use, I don't know. That's a lot of money.
Donahue says that while several cost-cutting recommendations were too broad to assign a dollar amount to them, early estimates put the savings at $600 million. One of the biggest cost savers is the reduction of the total number of state employees by 5% each year over the next 3 years. A 2009 study by the legislative auditor ranks Louisiana 13th among the 50 states for the ratio of state employees per 10,000 residents. Donahue estimates the elimination of 15,000 state workers will reap savings of $750 million over the 3-year period. Lionel Hardman is with the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees of Louisiana.
If we're going to look at state employees and the number of state employees in the state of Louisiana. Let's start at the top.
The legislative auditor indicates Louisiana's average ratio of supervisor to staff is 1-to-4. Hardman, who represents labor on the commission, supports focusing on the panel's recommendation of a 1-to-10 ratio.
The number of individuals who are performing the frontline services has decreased. So we're talking about reduction in state employees. Let's look at the managerial part, because those individuals are basically giving instruction and managing.
The Streamlining Commission also looked for opportunities to save money by outsourcing. The Department of Health and Hospitals, or DHH, has already begun to act on a recommendation to privatize its services for the developmentally disabled. The Legislative Fiscal Office calculates DHH could see annual savings of $9 million for every 100 individuals transferred to a private facility. Brandt cautions that privatization is not a panacea.
Oftentimes, where the state has tried to do that, it ends up costing more. Most recent example was the Department of Corrections wanted to outsource their food services. In other words, see if they could do it cheaper by using a private sector firm. They put it out for bid. The lowest bid came back, and it was still $1 million higher than what the state was spending on its food services.
For the more than 16,000 contracts the state does have, the Commission encourages more scrutiny and a 10% annual reduction in cost. Governor Jindal has indicated that a 10% cut is too rigid to be practical. The governor also opposes the suggestion to reduce the state budget by 2%. Commission Vice Chair Roy O. Martin feels the proposal has been mischaracterized as an across-the-board cut.
If you read the recommendation, it's the total budget needs to go down 2%, not necessarily each and every thing. I don't want, if we have a program that's useless, I want to cut it 100%. Whereas if we have a program that's really working, or a service that needs more money, we may want to increase it a little bit. But the overall expenditure should be 98% of what it was in 2009.
Martin, a business owner, also supports the panel's suggestion of moving the state's retirement system from a defined benefit plan towards a defined contribution plan.
Defined benefit plans, while they're safe for the employee, if they're not funded properly, they can bankrupt an organization. And I think that's what's happening in the state of Louisiana.
The state retirement system's current unfunded debt is $16.8 billion. Senator Butch Gautreaux chairs the Senate Retirement Committee. He says a defined contribution plan would not only put employees' payments at risk, but would require enrollment in Social Security. That would cost the state even more.
Now, as an employer, that contribution is 7.5%, where the normal cost, is between 5 and 6% today of payroll. And so right there you have an increase. And then you still have to deal with the unfunded accrued liability. It doesn't go away because you change plans.
No matter which recommendations the legislature and the governor embrace, Times-Picayune reporter Scott sees the panel's influence secondary to the demand for balancing the budget with dwindling revenues.
I think the fact at the end of the day is going to be that it's these requirements for spending cuts imposed by the new budget environment that's going to be driving a downsizing of state government more than probably the Streamlining Commission itself.
Well, joining me to explore which proposals they embrace and reject are our audience members. They include Baton Rouge area residents who are randomly recruited and surveyed for us by LSU's Public Policy Research Lab. We also have a member of the Legislative Youth Advisory Council from Luling. Of those who responded to our pre-show survey, 52% identify themselves as fiscal conservatives, 23% say they're moderate, while an equal number identify as liberal on economic issues. When asked their opinion on the Streamlining Commission's recommendation of cutting 5,000 state employees each year for the next 3 years, 76% disapproved and 23% approved of this idea. On the proposal to privatize certain state government services, such as the state-run centers for the developmentally disabled, 50% of respondents disapproved and 38% approved of this plan. And when asked how their views align with Governor Jindal's on dealing with the budget deficit, 42% agreed that the shortfall should be made up with spending cuts only. But slightly more respondents, 50%, disagreed, endorsing a combination of spending cuts and tax increases. So let's start there. Do you support a cuts-only approach, or should we have tax increases to help fill the revenue gap? And for those who do favor cuts, what should be cut? How do we do this? Brad, do we just cut? Do we tax and cut?
I think right now you've got to look at cuts. I don't think in any business, when there's a shortfall in the income stream, you've got to look at your overhead. And I don't necessarily think that more taxes are the answer right now.
No more taxes, more cuts to state government. Lucinda?
I think that I would favor taxing because cutting state government is going to not only reach those that are in the higher positions, but in the lower ones also. And right now, I think it may be really bad for those people that are already making lower salaries.
Maya, I see you nodding your head.
Yes, I agree with what Lucinda said. I can't agree with what Brad said. Because if you cut these 5,000 people per year, which ends up at 15,000, where are these people going to go? I don't understand. What kind of unemployment are they going to get if they get any? Because being unemployed, first you become unemployed in January, you might be unemployed all the way to next year in January. So what are these people going to get? You can't be on welfare because you might not even be able to get welfare. So what are these people going to get? How are they going to benefit from these cuts? You can't just say, okay, I'm going to cut you from your job. Where are they going to go? They might end up homeless, and they probably can't pay their mortgage if they have a mortgage. So what we're going to do if we cut these people? What's going to happen?
So we've got to keep people. Can we cut services? Ben?
Well, I think you've got to cut the cloth to fit the problem. And the problem is that we're 125% of the southern average of state employees leaving out the hospitals. So the situation has to result in job cuts.
We've got too many state workers.
We've enjoyed years of plenty, and we are in a situation of want.
And so we need to cut. The commission made a lot of other recommendations. Are there any others that you think are the right kinds of recommendations? Paul?
It's a tough decision, but like I said, I run my household. If I don't have the money, you can't spend it. And okay, if the state's out of money, cuts got to come. People lose their job every day. I've lost jobs, and what you have to do is adapt and overcome. You lose your job. When I got out of school, I dropped out of LSU because I didn't want to go to school. I'm 52 years old, and I've never gone a year without being in school. So, you're always in school learning something. And if you lose a job today, you got to stay on top of what's going on to get another job tomorrow.
Is there anything that we as a state need to learn? Ben, you talked about the fact that we're above average. And Paul, you said you're always learning. Can we look at other states to figure out what they are doing to accomplish some of these goals? Don?
Well, I don't know the other states. My concern is, we just not found out we have a shortfall. Because, when we elected Jindal, the first thing I saw these guys giving themselves a raise. You understand? It's a mindset, you don't just pop up today and find out we $3 billion, So, we just got to keep our nose to the grind. And, these things make people very angry, It's like, the state supervisors are not in line with the state people. Now, you say the land of plenty, time of plenty. I ain't seen it. Okay? So, I think if we cut back, we need protections from a lot of companies coming in here and making bad examples, taking advantage of people. What do we do,
And I understand, part of it is if we cut services, well, what do we lose with part of that? And then the other question kind of related to what you're talking about is, we talked a little bit about adding private companies to do some of the jobs that the state was doing. Is that a good idea? Is that a way to cut jobs, but also, maintain jobs for other people?
No. Because who are going to work these private jobs, and it's going to be harder for the people who used to work to get into these private companies because when these private companies come in, they already come in with their people who they're going to hire. So how are the people who used to work these jobs before privatization going to get on these jobs. They need to make it available. If you're going to privatize something, you should say, well, we're going to privatize it, but can you open the doors for the people that we laid off? And I think that would be a better way, because at least you still could get a job, like if she got laid off, and say, okay, well, Diana, you can go in and apply in with this private organization, and they probably would hire her, instead of saying, well, Diana, you don't have no job, and this private company came in, so Diane can't get a job. That's not right.
Diane, is there anything else we can do?
I'd like to have a job. I'm sorry.
Is privatization the way?
I really don't know enough about it really to say. I did read where, and like he said on the film, when they tried to privatize the food situation at the prisons, it ended up costing more. So I'm sure there are some companies that the bids, they can look at the bids and they may be better for us, but I guess that's just one thing they'll have to look at. But I do agree with cutting some of the workforce, but I don't know that I agree with the 5% over 3 years. I do not understand why Bobby Jindal hired, the state employee payroll, he hired 3% more in his first year, state employees, and now they're wanting to cut back 5% over 3 years. To me, that doesn't make a lot of sense.
And so if the governor is going to tighten his belt, if we all need to tighten our belts, and the governor needs to be a part of that.
Sure.
I think Don had a good point that there's been a lot written in the press about cuts, but there was never much written about the failure to see that this catastrophe was coming down the road.
Chad, you're nodding your head. You agree? Can we forecast these things?
Well, I don't know if we can forecast from the literature that we read before coming in. It looks like a big part of the shortfall was from the calculation for Medicaid payments. So I would think some of our energies would be better spent addressing that. What was the fault in the formula, and how can that be corrected rather than just trying to plug the hole that was left by it?
One of the places we end up cutting or trying to fill the hole is with higher education and with healthcare. And so a lot of times higher ed and healthcare see the cuts. Is there a better way? Is there something else that we can do to not have that problem continue in the future? Felicia?
I agree with downsizing in jobs. Several years ago, if some of you recall, McDonnell Douglas, you had a lot of people walking around with papers, just walking around with papers, but they were supervisors, very top heavy. They laid off over 10,000 people nationwide, and the economy absorbed them. I guess they're all doing fine. And to me, with the state, I think it's very, very top heavy. We need to start from the top and work our way down. There is too many supervisors, just too much overhead. And I think if they start thinning out the jobs, then the economy will eventually absorb them as well.
And so maybe, and I think they talked about it a little bit in the package, that maybe going from one supervisor for every 4 employees to maybe 1 to 8 or 1 to 10. Everybody's nodding their head.
There should be 1 to at least 10.
Yeah, especially when you have so many supervisors that are making $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 a year.
Absolutely.
And they're only managing maybe 1 or 2 people. That's a waste. That's where streamlining comes in. That's how you absorb the cost. You can get rid of a couple of those supervisors, make the supervisory pool of employees larger, thereby saving the money. So now you've saved 2 or 3 sets of $90,000. That adds up quicker than cutting off people who are making $20,000, $40,000 a year, when over the long run, that's not that much money.
Gary, I thought you also were nodding your head. You agree?
Well, I would agree we need to cut the number of state workers. We need to look at it to give the state the best services for the least amount of money. We just can't be an employment machine for people. They'll find jobs if they're laid off or they're not rehired. And there's ways in state government also besides just through cutting employment. We can look at combining commissions and departments of state government in order to cut costs as well.
And actually, Celeste, you also...
Yeah, my comment is about the demographics of the top level of the state agencies. Do we have a plan that addresses when people will start to attrit so that you can gradually move them out? I don't know if that 5% is the number that is the appropriate number. But at the same time, the more senior people are leaving, we still need to develop our base with our young talent here, because you don't want everyone leaving the state because they can't get the types of jobs that others have in other communities.
And speaking of young talent, Michael, what do you think we should do to help streamline government?
Well, in terms of streamlining government, I think it's a matter of the allocation scheme that we use. I've seen situations where you can take a budget that's very minimal, and by reallocating the funds, you can provide ample resources for all of the employees, for all of the people involved. So instead of focusing on necessarily everything we need to cut, we need to focus on not only that, but where we're allocating our resources. Say we're allocating them to something that's completely worthless, well, instead of having our funds there, we move them. We don't necessarily cut them out of the budget, but we move them to somewhere where they can be better used.
And actually, I think that was some of the things that the Streamlining Commission talked about. Maybe not across the board cuts, but we need to figure out what agencies are working well, which agencies are not working well, and kind of figure out what to do next. But we're going to get our experts in a couple of minutes. And so when we return, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to further discuss streamlining in Louisiana. Welcome back to Louisiana Public Square. We're discussing streamlining Louisiana government. Joining us now are 3 members from the Streamlining Commission and a journalist from the CABL News Bureau. Senator Mike Michot is a Republican from Lafayette who chairs the Senate Finance Committee, which appropriates state funds. Before his election to the Senate in 2000, Michot served as a representative for 4 years. John Neely Kennedy is the treasurer for the state of Louisiana. In his position as treasurer, Kennedy manages the state's $5 billion bank account, including the investment of $3 billion in trust funds. Barry Erwin is the president of the Council for a Better Louisiana, a statewide nonprofit that works on quality of life issues. Erwin was a gubernatorial appointee to the Streamlining Commission. Mark Ballard has been the editor in charge of the Advocate's CABL News Bureau since 2007. The CABL News Bureau is among the largest covering state government in the country. Let's go to our participants for their questions. And Margo, I think you wanted to start us off. We didn't talk as much about health care as I thought we would in the first half, but you've got a question for us on health care.
Several, but it seems like our health care, this whole dilemma is not only affects me, but children in Louisiana. And where do we start with that, Mr. Kennedy?
Well, here's our problem. We have 1.23 million people in Louisiana on Medicaid, which is a federal state program. We spend about $6.5 billion a year, state and federal money, to deliver care to those folks. The cost of health care and the cost of Medicaid goes up every year. Next year, we're not going to have the same amount of money that we had this year to do that, to fund the Medicaid program. The only rational way to address that problem, in my opinion, is to do something that we've never done before, and that's prioritize the services that we provide in Medicaid. In other words, you just make a list. And if you're at the bottom of the list, it doesn't mean that that service is not as important. It's not as important as things at the top of the list, like payments to doctors and payments to hospitals. At the bottom of the list, you would have things like administrative overhead, transportation. And if you prioritize the services and you have X amount of dollars to spend, you properly fund your most important services until you run out of money, and the services that are less important, not unimportant, but less important, don't get funded. That's the only rational way to do it. When we do across-the-board provider cuts, what we're doing is watering down the soup, in my opinion.
Senator?
Well, I was just going to say, too, I think there are some structural things that we can do as well. And some of them are controversial and they're sort of, big items. But one of the things that came up, and I think y'all discussed it a little bit, and certainly in your survey, had to do with the developmental centers, that the state runs a lot of institutions, big institutions that have people with developmental disabilities. I mean, on the one hand, it seems like that's a great safety net for those folks because they have needs. But really, best practices in other states really look to a different model that's actually cheaper, number one, and number two, actually provides a more appropriate care in appropriate setting, and that would be more in a community home or a community setting. It's very difficult to go and close down these institutions because you talked about employment and those types of things, but the truth is we can save a lot of money by downsizing and closing down these institutions around the state, the many of them that we have, but also provide a more appropriate setting for folks. So we can do two things at once in some of those. So I think we have to look at all of these kinds of options.
But the closing down that you're talking about is Charity Hospital. It's Earl K. Long.
Well, I was talking about developmental centers.
But eventually we're talking about the charity hospitals.
And I think that's probably a part of the situation too. And I think that the Commission addressed that in one of the recommendations. I think if you look at what we have in Louisiana compared to other states, we've got a system of public hospitals that are state-run and state-operated. They don't do it that way in other states. A lot of them have local or regional ones that are supported by a local tax base. They have different models. We need to look, I think, at that same type of thing as to whether we can provide that same kind of care in the private sector, because our hospitals do have capacity there. It's difficult, again, it's very controversial, but we're already starting to see some of those things happening, in fact, here in Baton Rouge.
And the truth is, if the health care legislation passes in Washington, it will mean the end of our charity hospital system. Now, some think that is good, some think it's bad, but it's just a fact, because we get money now called disproportionate share money from Washington, D.C. to treat the uninsured. We use that money to run our charity hospital system. Those uninsureds are now going to have insurance, so the federal government will stop sending us the disproportionate share money, and we won't have the money to run charity hospital. And theoretically, we won't need it because everybody will have insurance.
We need to make sure that the people of the state have basic access to primary care, particularly in the rural areas, because that's a big part of the problem is they don't have access to basic primary care. And as John mentioned, putting the resources into that basic primary care through the Medicaid program and getting physicians to participate in the Medicaid program will hopefully keep some of these people out of the hospital, because that's where the large cost is institutionalized care, whether it's our hospitals or our group homes or developmental centers.
And Diane, I know you had a couple of questions, but one kind of involving how we go from 5% or 3% and how some agencies are hiring but others are not.
Well, I was just astounded when I read in the report that during Governor Jindal's first year in office, the state employees increased by 3%, and now here he is in his second year in office, and he's or the commission or him, either one, wants to try to reduce the workforce by 5% over 3 years. So I really didn't understand why it increased the first year. I mean, where did those employees, where did they go? What were they doing? And now they're not needed any longer, or, where did they go to? And where are they wanting to cut the 5% from? Is it different than the 3% that he hired the first year? I mean, it just really did not, the equation didn't work out for me in my head.
The budget picture really made a drastic turn when you think of the post-Katrina Rita era, where we had an influx of federal dollars coming into the state's economy. We had a robust economy. Oil and gas was at up to $140 a barrel, the price of oil. So when you look at the state budget, we had a couple of years of surplus, and then it went in reverse, where we had declining oil and gas prices. The nation was going into a recessionary period, so we had to start tightening up, and that's where the cutting came in. Particularly over the last year, and what we're going to see in the next 2 years.
Well, now here is the problem. We rank number 1 in the South and number 8 in America in the number of state government positions per 10,000 people, and we have for a long time. We will never be number 1 in the South in health care or education or infrastructure or coastal restoration, as long as we're number 1 in the South in the number of state government jobs. Alabama's bigger than we are, and they do the same job with 89,000 people. Okay, we have a big turnover rate. We have about 17,000 vacancies every year in state government. What I've suggested that we do is not fill 5,000 of those vacancies each year for the next 3 years. No one gets fired, nobody gets laid off. I would even support taking 20% of the savings and using it to increase salaries for employees in the trenches who take on additional responsibilities. But the fact of the matter is that we can choose between spending all our money on labor, or we can properly fund health care and education and higher education. But we don't have the money to do both.
But there's another part of the puzzle there too. If we're going to do, as the Treasurer even mentioned, for instance, in healthcare, in Medicaid, trying to prioritize things, when you do that, what you're going to be doing is saying, this is an important priority, these other things are lesser priorities. If you reduce those priorities, if you reduce the funding for those, what you do intrinsically is you reduce employees. You don't need people to provide that service if you're not going to provide that service. So you're really looking at a couple of things there. And on the one hand, that's a very strategic thing to do. If we're going to have to cut, we want to keep what's most important. But if we cut the things that are less important, that's going to be people as well. But at least it will be part of a strategy and not part of, just an arbitrary. And I'm not saying that is. I'm just saying that's the way that we need to address those type of things.
Well, I have a question about the. You say those statistics, but actually, as far as civil servants go, that we are not nearly that high. The numbers come up when you're talking about appointed state workers that are outside of the civil service system.
That's true, but they still get salaries.
Well, and they're still government employees.
And they are government. But you're right, Mark. I mean, we have in the last 5 or 10 years, the number of political appointees has gone up. The number of civil servants has gone down. The average political appointee in Louisiana makes about $62,000 a year.
It's about 30% more than what the average civil servant does, and they are appointed by
that's true. But what I'm talking about in terms of not filling the vacancies, that would apply to both political appointees and civil servants.
My second point is I think that the real problem that we had with the Streamlining Commission is that there's no mission ever articulated. There's no strategy of where we want to go. What's important for government? What do you want to see your government fund? And we never got that, and we still haven't really gotten that.
Good point.
Well, and actually, Gary, you had a question that kind of relates to what Mark was talking about. That you said, are there any places that are doing it right?
Well, are there any departments of government that are making a profit, so to speak, that are taking in more revenue than they're spending out? And I assume that there probably is, but there's not. We don't need to cut everything. Probably there's maybe some things that need to be increased or looked at. Government can't run totally like a business, but there's probably some areas of government that is profitable.
Are there any best practices?
There are. I mean, certain agencies and departments operate exclusively off of self-generated fees and licenses. If you're the Department of Environmental Quality, for example, you receive fees from those that you regulate and do an environmental regulation. They are almost exclusively dependent upon that revenue source as opposed to state general fund. And ideally, we'd like to get that there with as many of the agencies and departments as we possibly can, but they can't all do that. Wildlife and Fisheries receives fees for licenses, for hunting and fishing licenses. Department of Natural Resources receives fees and permit fees from the oil and gas industry for permitting oil and gas wells. I think they are 100% dependent upon those fees, so they don't receive any outside money. But you take higher education and health care, they are largely dependent on state general fund dollars. That's why when we look at cuts. But you can do it, and we're trying to get as many of the agencies and departments to be that way, but not all of them can just because of the nature of what they do for our citizens.
And does it mean that we could let parks increase some of their fees, or do we let LSU increase its fees?
Yeah, that's you want to look at that demand.
A tax is $1, a fee is $1, and I would suggest that the agencies and commissions in this state have gone far beyond their revenue intake facility versus their expenditures. If you drive around this town, every agency and commission has its own piece of real estate and its own new building.
Well,
which is taken out of the private sector.
Right.
I'm not one who believes that we ought to increase taxes or fees. Our budget is roughly $29 billion. In 1996, the budget was $12 billion. On January 1, 2005, before the first hurricane ever hit Louisiana, the budget was $19 billion. So in a very short period of time, we've gone from a $12 billion budget to a $19 billion budget to a $29 billion budget. Now, we're not going to have $29 billion next year or the next year or the next year, but we're going to probably have 25 or 26. And I contend, given the fact that we're number 9 in America in per capita spending, that if we spend that $25 or $26 billion, as Barry talked about, strategically and the way you manage your household budget or the way you manage your business's budget, then we've got enough money. I also don't think taxes will solve the problem.
But more than half of those of that shortfall is coming from tax credits that benefited primarily well-to-do people. I mean, and thank you very much, because I am able to take advantage of the private school tuition tax credit, and I am now able to take advantage of the excess itemized deduction. And this is all very good and everything, but are we not making a decision to help me out at the expense of the people who use our state hospitals, the 1/4 of our population that is under Medicaid?
Well, let me give you another statistic, Mark. The best way to create jobs is to create an environment in which capital feels comfortable. Capital is mobile today in a global economy. It can move anywhere it wants to. We rank number 5 in America in the percentage of total taxes paid by business. Changing that one statistic would be the most important thing we could do in terms of economic development. Now, many of the tax reductions in the past 5-10 years have been to business taxes or to personal income taxes, which business people pay along with everybody else. There's a reason that Texas and Florida, even despite the recession, have been growing, and states like California and Massachusetts and New Jersey are not. It has to do, I contend, with their tax base. Certainly you need a certain amount of money to run government. But all things being equal, I think the best way to create jobs in Louisiana is to become a low-tax state. But to do that, you've got to become a low cost of government state.
Well, doesn't government, though, actually help bring about economic development? And I'm stealing this from James Fallow, so I'm giving credit, but he points out that the folks that found Google they're wonderful entrepreneurs, they're wildly intelligent, and they are using a platform that was developed by the U.S. government. Government created the situation for which people with entrepreneurs with intelligence can create new businesses.
They can, but they generally don't.
Well, Adrian, you had a question kind of related to that with higher ed, and so your concern was about higher ed and how that affects.
My question about higher ed, with the cutbacks in higher education, it's going to take longer for certain people to get out of school, and that takes longer for them to get employed. How can you attract businesses when our viable employee base is shrinking? Because you don't have the graduates, or it's going to take longer to get those graduates you need to attract those healthy businesses who are looking for qualified individuals. So yeah, we have people, but we need qualified people to attract businesses to say, okay, they have people that want to work, we can come here. But when you don't have that, those businesses aren't coming, they're not looking at you.
And I would say higher education, our organization has been involved with this a lot, and I think we're very, very concerned about the situation facing higher education. I have a hard time looking at the numbers that are out there right now if they stay on the track that they're on, and figuring out how our educational institutions, our post-secondary education institutions, are not going to be hurt very, very detrimentally, more so than we have ever seen. That said, there are still some things that we can do and probably should do to try and mitigate some of this to the best way that we can. One is to more fully use our community colleges and expand the capacity there, where individuals, we have one of the lowest, well really, the lowest graduation rate, completion rate over 6 years in post-secondary education in four-year universities in the entire South. We're at the very, very bottom. What that means is we've got people going into those schools that are not prepared. It's not the appropriate setting for them, and so they're not staying and dropping out. Community colleges are a much more appropriate and cost-effective setting for a lot of those folks. If we can rebalance to some degree, I'm not talking about drastic or radical, but if we can rebalance the number of folks going into four-year schools and failing versus those going into two-year schools where they have a better chance of succeeding, we can save money and I think improve educational attainment if we can do that.
And the idea is we also had a similar commission to the Streamlining Commission that was set up specifically to address higher education, so hopefully they won't be hit with such severe budget cuts. And that commission is coming up with some recommendations. We can look at consolidation of some of our four-year institutions. We have certain clusters of the state where you have 2 or 3 or 4 four-year schools just within a few miles of each other. So we need to take those resources and, as Barry said, channel them into the technical and community colleges where people can learn a trade and get a skill. And if an employer decides they want to locate in Louisiana, we can get a skilled and trained workforce available for them, within a short period of time.
I'll tell you what you can do if you want to eliminate cuts to higher education. Here's the way you do it. And you could substitute health care or any other service we provide for this. And this is the quickest way to do it. We have 16,000 consulting contracts that have been issued in state government. We spend $7.5 billion a year. 25% of our budget spent on consulting contracts. I'm not saying they're all wasteful. I'm really not. It's not a question of being wasteful. It's a question of being a priority. And if you want to eliminate all the cuts for higher education, what you would do is start with our very first consulting contract and review every single one. And the question you ask yourself is, do we really need to be doing this? Are we really getting a good result? And is this money better spent for this or for higher education? And if you can eliminate 10% of those consulting contracts, you'll save $750 million. And again, that's not a statement that that $750 million is being wasteful. The statement would be, no, it's better spent in higher education. And I can tell you these contracts, there's so many of them. The legislature doesn't know about them because these are issued by the department. And there's so many of them, they keep getting rolled over and over. And I contend that not all of them are essential services. I think we could probably eliminate 10 to 20% of them and never miss them. That'd be $1.5 billion.
Me?
Bobby Jindal said that when he got in office, he was going to do his best, his very, very best, to make sure that Louisiana students, graduates, would stay inside of Louisiana. And I'm not saying that at all. All my friends who were born and reared in Louisiana, they're moving to Texas, they're moving to New York, they're moving to Chicago, they're moving to Atlanta. They're moving to California because this is not the land of opportunity, and it's hard for us to get jobs. And I understand the budget cuts, we need some of them, but cutting education, especially I'm a substitute teacher, some of these kids can't even read. And that needs to be the last thing that they cut. And then a lot of these kids that are in these high schools, they're not getting, it's like the objective of the counselor is to get the kids to go to BRCC. Don't make sure that they get all the credits they need. And that's why a lot of these children end up at BRCC when they can be going to a 4-year, starting off at a 4-year in college like Southern, LSU, or ULM, or ULL. It's harder. Somebody's not doing their job. There's no need for BRCC. You need to set the standards high instead of telling these children to go to technical colleges.
What I'm saying is not about lowering standards or lowering expectations. We need to continue to do that. The point I'm trying to make is that we have in Louisiana 60% of the students that enroll first-time freshmen in 4-year institutions do not graduate after 6 years. We're losing 60%. They're not prepared for 4-year schools. The ones that are prepared, they need to be there. We want them to have all of those opportunities, but that's not always the right setting for a lot of those kids. Community colleges are geared more towards kids who maybe are not as performing well, didn't do as well in high school, don't quite have, they need some remedial help, they need some more nurturing type of help that they can give them in those situations. But we're not at all saying that the 4-year schools don't have a very critical and important mission, and I think the standards need to be high and we need to have high expectations, but we have to have some mechanism for these kids who are not making it out of school at 4-year institutions after 6 years.
I think the real question is,
remember when we were open admissions, I'm a student of, I graduated Southern University undergrad, as well as my sister and my brother-in-law, and my brother-in-law is a veterinarian, and my sister, she works for UTMB. I can't totally say that because when Southern University was open admission, Southern University has catered to every student on every level. You can come in on a low level, and they cater to these students just as BRCC has. I think if Southern University was open admission like it used to be, instead of bringing out BRCC, I think that they would cater to these students just as BRCC has. But it's like the enrollment has gone down and saying, like you said, I read the statistics about the
I know Mark was also going to answer just because we're running out of time, and so I don't want to talk too much on higher because I know there are 2 other people with some questions. But Mark.
Just a quick point. First off, I'm a civilian. They make the decisions. Okay, so, but let me point out.
Mark gets all the tax breaks.
I get the tax breaks. Thank you very much. Let me point out, though, that we're in a state that has, 4.2 million people in it, and we have 14 4-year universities. And I would say that there's too many of them, and they're dragging down LSU, they're dragging down Southern. Which ones are we going to close? How about ULL? Would that be one that we could close, or maybe Southeastern? I mean, the choices. The problem is that somebody's got to have the bottom to stand up and say, this is the one that we got to do.
Yeah. But the same thing happens with community college.
Felicia.
I just want to say I totally disagree with you because of the fact I went to a state community college in Illinois. I received an associate's degree in liberal arts. Okay, everybody is not a 4-year person. Majority of the people I went to college with made it through 3 years, and they dropped out. They had nothing. I went to a 2-year college. I had an associate's degree, and then I built on that associate's degree through the years. I've been working for 32 years at 48. So I'm a master. I don't need a master's degree because I've earned that through the years the hard way.
That's not what I was saying.
But and there are a lot of children that are barely making it through high school. You just advised that children cannot read. Everybody cannot afford to go to a 4-year university, nor do they have the mentality to deal with a 4-year university. I would rather see a child with a 2-year degree and build on that as opposed to trying to struggle to go for 4 years. So I think it's well needed.
And I was going to say, I don't know if the Streamlining Commission covered that as much. Ladies, we need you back when we're talking about higher ed. We'll talk about higher ed again more. We got a whole show for it. But I know, Chad, you also had a question about retirement. And so switching from higher ed to higher age.
And a very simple question. We were reading through, they were talking about addressing the state's 4 retirement systems.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we have 4 retirement systems?
We actually have more than 4.
13 or so.
4 statewide, and then we have a bunch on top of that.
Would that be an area that could be consolidated?
It could, but we have so many because of turf. I mean, I can tell you. You would have some savings. The real savings, though, will come if you make the hard decision to go to a defined contribution plan instead of a defined benefit plan. Not a single American business in the last 25 years has adopted a defined benefit plan. The only entities that have been governments. And the reason is because of the unfunded accrued liability. And you just have better control of your costs under a defined contribution plan. And if we went to one, it doesn't mean folks in the old systems are going to be affected. They would be grandfathered in. But we now have, $14 billion UAL? That's money that's got to be paid off.
And Treasurer, I know that you're familiar with the terms, but sometimes
unfunded accrued liability.
Okay, and so
that means we're $14 billion in the hole in terms of what we've got to pay out in the future.
And we got there because of
the legislature as the employer contribution. The legislature over the years, this goes back to probably the 50s, I guess, when it started, didn't meet its obligation of funding the employer portion over the years. So the legislature, the state general fund, kicks in $300 to $400 million a year, so that it grows and grows. And then there's been groups that have come to the legislature that have gotten increases here and increases there. So that's different. Some of the other systems that we were referring to have come and they work the legislature and they get increase. So they get increased benefits. So that costs the system more.
And Brad,
I'm just curious how the Streamlining Commission, how deep it's going into the for instance, the 400 programs, in the government right now, which are under dedicated funds, protected by laws in the state where we can't go after the funds. I mean, right now I think it's $3.9 billion of a state budget, roughly 10%. Are we looking into those? I mean, I would assume anytime you're looking at a budget across the board, you got to look at every cost pool. And are we looking at those? Are those off limits? Or are we actually going into those?
We actually passed the bill. The legislature passed the bill to begin that review process, because you can imagine, I've been there a few years, but a lot of these guys are brand new because of term limits. We're just getting to know what all these funds are all about, and the treasurer actually brought it to our attention that there's so many funds that are out there. So we've had hearings through the Joint Budget Committee to see what the source of revenue is, what the money is used for, how much money is in the fund, and some of them are very legitimate needs. But I mean, there's some that are sitting on a sizable amount of money that they may not need all that money, and a lot of that came up during the Streamlining Commission as well. So we have started that process. We're not nearly through, but we have started that process of reviewing all the dedicated funds.
Michael, and then Ben.
I know we've statutorily dedicated a lot of funds, and from what he was saying, and in the retirement for that matter, are we working on consolidating things, or are we working on possibly adjusting the Constitution? I know that's been talked about before, but it's not gotten a lot of publicity lately because of the cuts. If we can change the Constitution, potentially, we can also reallocate some of those funds and get rid of some of those dedicated funds so we can protect higher education, health care.
You don't need to change the Constitution. We do have constitutionally dedicated funds.
For some of the funds, you do have to change the Constitution.
We have constitutionally dedicated funds, but the funds that I think Brad's talking about, we have over 300 statutorily dedicated funds that can be undedicated with just a vote of the legislature. And frankly, that's where the real money is. The constitutionally dedicated funds are minimal. It's the Louisiana Education Quality Trust Fund, which I don't think the people would vote to touch, nor do I think we should. It's the Tobacco Settlement Trust Fund.
I don't have lobbyists that are protecting those interests, and those people are not going to want you to take that out of the Constitution. So how do you propose to deal with that?
Well, I would start with the statutory funds, and that's what Mike and his committee are doing. That's where I would start. And I don't think anybody's saying that those statutorily dedicated funds are necessarily wasting money. That's not the issue. The issue is if you dedicate your money over here to this interest, and because of that you've got to cut higher education and health care, you've got to ask yourself, what's more important, the interest here I'm dedicating money to, or higher education or health care? In some cases, it may be the interest, but in a lot of cases, it may not be.
We did discover funds that had been on the books for a certain number of years that are now obsolete or they're no longer necessary. So we will begin the sunset review of getting rid of those funds because they're no longer needed. They don't serve any purpose.
And Mark, you were saying that there are some things that we need to actually worry about constitutionally, or you think?
No, there are some funds, but like the MFP, the fund that is used to pay for public schools is constitutional.
That is a good one. We probably ought to look at that.
And we probably, well, you all did have a recommendation, though, is it, with the student-based budgeting, which would change the MFP, wouldn't it? It would change how the money would go.
How it's delivered to the local school systems, to try and get it more focused on classrooms as opposed to school districts and the administration part, to ensure that an appropriate amount of money is getting to those schools and that they have some flexibility, hopefully, within those schools to manage those dollars more so than they do.
The money now goes to the district, and the district kind of sends it to the schools based on what the staffing is like. Now, I don't know where you go, but I mean, if you went to Terra, they get your $5,000, and then if you go to Baton Rouge High, Terra loses it, and now Baton Rouge High gets your $5,000
location. Yeah.
Ben?
I have a couple questions related to the Streamlining Commission. First, I think it was a wonderful undertaking, and I think you've accomplished a lot. And I would guess that if your recommendations, I read 62 pages of them in the printed out summary.
You need to get a life, Ben.
And that's only about a tenth of the book. You know,
I congratulate you. Thank you.
You'll meet your 800,000. Yeah. But none of them are really earth-shaking strategic points.
No.
So that's off the table as far as restructuring.
Well, I don't know that you... I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say, I hope that's not. I think really and truly, if you look in very practical terms, we had a very limited time frame to do some things, and it took a while to begin to get into these agencies and understand them, and by the time you start to get some understanding, you've run out of time. I would like to think that this is kind of the first bite of the apple as we've done some of these things. But I think at the end of the day, I mean, we need to be honest. I think the Streamlining Commission came up with some ideas for efficiencies, some things to direct dollars in some different ways, a lot of good ideas that we can at least put on the table and let the legislature decide. But at the end of the day, you know, it's the governor and I think the legislature that need to provide the leadership to say these are the things that are really ones that are the most important things for our state, and we've got to save and prioritize those. And the other things need to kind of fall by the wayside. We could say all that till we're blue in the face, but I think at the end of the day, you really need that leadership from the top to make those kind of things happen.
Well, shouldn't they be doing this regularly? Government should be doing this regularly, and I think that one problem that the Streamlining Commission has set up is that, you know, we've done it periodically, and now here's 263 recommendations, everything's finished. We're good now, and I don't think that's really. We're not really good.
And Mark, the comment he made, I think when he first talked, he hit the nail on the head. Okay, what we need to do is sit down, our legislature, and say what vital services do we really want to deliver, and rank them. If higher education is your most important priority, I'm not saying it should be or shouldn't be, but if you rank them, something's going to be. If it's higher education, that's where you spend your money first. If health care is second, that's where you spend your money second. And you go down the list until you run out of money. Will there be consensus on this? No. I mean, these are tough issues. But that's what priority spending is. That's what families do every day and businesses do every day. And government is not used to doing that. We haven't had to in the last decade in Louisiana, but the time has come that we have to.
And Ben, unfortunately, we react to pressure. So when the things were good and there's money coming in, just like with your own personal budget of your business, you adapt. But when you're forced to downsize, we have to pass by the Constitution a balanced budget. So we are going to be forced to make cuts. The streamlining recommendation actually brought a lot of ideas to light that the administration has already acted upon. They've taken an initiative to say we're going to do this through executive order or through their budget process. I think the legislature is probably going to handle another batch of recommendations, not all of them, but some of the things that we can feel like we can implement and get passed. And the other ones, some of them are longer term. They may be a 2 to 3 to 4 year before we fully implement them.
Well, we've had a recommendation to cut our conversation short, gentlemen. So we want to thank our panelists, Senator Michot, Treasurer Kennedy, Mr. Erwin, and Mr. Ballard. When we come back, we'll have a few closing comments.
Well, a complicated topic again, indeed, and I don't think too short a time to come up with any consensus, I guess.
No, but actually I learned a lot. I read the proposals, and so it was actually good to hear what they meant. And so sometimes you can read a line or two and not really understand it, and so for me I felt like I got a little more.
Well, in the interviews for the background piece, we put up some longer sections online, so you can read those. I think Royo Martin really wanted to talk about the highway department we didn't get to. And I think his concern was that we only use the equipment 25% of the time and don't move it around the state. Right. So there are all sorts of things to look at and different ways of examining some of this, but a good conversation.
Absolutely, and we still also have to talk about higher ed more. We know we'll have to come back to that soon.
We always come back to education, I think. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Louisiana Public Square. We encourage you to tell us how you think Louisiana needs to streamline by commenting on our website at lpb.org/public square. While you're there, you can also watch expanded interviews from our backgrounder, take this month's survey, and submit a topic idea for a future show. Don't forget, you can now follow us on Twitter and Facebook.
Louisiana is hoping for a share of the $4 billion federal Race to the Top grant designed to encourage education reform. How will proposals in the state's application alter education in Louisiana? Join us in February for Educational Race to Reform. Thanks for watching, and good night.
Good night, everyone.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org. Support for this program is provided by the men and women of the Louisiana Forestry Association. Through sustainable forestry, LFA members promote the health and productivity of Louisiana's forests for generations to come. And the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.